Let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Swissnex. My name is Benjamin. I'm the head of science programs at Swissnex. First of all, I want to welcome you to Switzerland, as the very ground you are sitting on right now is officially a Swiss territory, a very neutral one. This event tonight is part of a two-day conference called Crisis Code. And I am co-leading this conference with Martin Schwarz, who is here on my left, and who is in charge of public diplomacy at the Swiss Consulate. First of all, I want to start with a quick show of hands. Who in the room is working on issues related to humanitarian action or human rights? Great. Who is more on the tech side, working on computer science, cybersecurity, data? Great. And maybe there's some people working on digital policy, internet governance, a few. Great. It's fantastic because our initiative is very much about bringing these very different worlds together so that you better understand the potential humanitarian implications your work here in Silicon Valley might have on crisis-affected populations.
Thank you. Let me just point out that this is the first evening and the end of the first day of a two-day conference called Crisis Code, Humanitarian Protection in the Digital Age. This morning we had two closed expert-only workshops, not expert-only workshops, but workshops with superb experts, many of whom are here tonight. Thank you for coming back. The first was on the changing nature of war in an age where cyber has so many new meanings. And the second is on potential threats of harm that can come to affected communities and civilians through the work that in the digital sphere that the humanitarian sector itself does. Now, this evening completes this cycle, getting together all of these people in a different, more kind of relaxed, non-Chatham House environment where we can really say our minds. So I want to thank you all for being here. We're going to continue with remarks and then the panel in just a minute. I introduce to you now the Consul General of Switzerland, Hans-Ulrich Tanner.
Thank you. Warm welcome. Thank you for being here. As Consul General of Switzerland, it's my pleasure to have you at Switzerland Pier 17, a very special place. For those of you who haven't been here before, this place is an experiment in interdisciplinary thinking, working out of Swissnex, San Francisco right here, and the Swiss Consulate just behind the wall. Diplomats, scholars, technologists, entrepreneurs, artists, trade commissioners, and many more come together every day to deepen ties between Switzerland and the Western US. We call this the living lab for diplomacy. And there could hardly be a better illustration of this concept than the Crisis Code conference and the event we are holding tonight. Let me add that tonight's discussion and the Crisis Code conference are part of the Swiss Touch campaign. Swiss Touch is an initiative that brings together diverse stakeholders and fresh perspectives for conversations on innovation and pressing current issues. Each discussion takes place around this artisanal table which was custom built in the Alps. Now, Switzerland's humanitarian tradition is at the core of our self-understanding and of our role in the world, and is written into our constitution that Switzerland contributes to the alleviation of hardship and poverty in the world, to respect for human rights and to the promotion of democracy and the peaceful coexistence of nations. As the custodian of the Geneva Convention, we are proud to demonstrate our commitment to humanitarian protection and human rights. But we who are deeply about these things must recognize that, especially now in the information age, the threats facing civilian populations change every day. In order to counter these new humanitarian risks, we first must understand them. And that is why tonight's conversation is so vital. My thanks go to the World Affairs Council for their efforts around this event, to all Crisis Codes partners, organizations from academia, tech, NGOs, and the public sector, to our panelists and our fine moderator, Joseph Guay. Finally, sincere thanks to all of you for joining the discussion. Let me now pass the floor to my dear colleague, the CEO of Swissnex here, and at the very place here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I actually don't want to make this long. I think the most important things have been said. It's a great pleasure also from my side to welcome you here, specifically at Swissnex. We share the Swiss peer. This space is, I'd say, the public outlet of the thinking that we do behind the walls. We often talk about it as the physical manifestation of the work that Swissnex has been doing here in San Francisco for 15 years. So Swissnex San Francisco understands itself as a living lab. Jome mentioned it, living lab for diplomacy, or more generally speaking, a living lab for collaboration. Collaboration that transcends borders, it transcends industries, it transcends disciplines. We foster collaboration through events, through workshops, conferences, seminars, as well as things that happen behind the scenes that are probably less visible to people out there, where we work with companies, we work with startups, we work with universities, helping them gain a foothold here in the San Francisco Bay Area, connecting them with vital partners to further their agendas, to prepare them for tomorrow. This is what Swissnex does. For us, today has been another great show of what can happen when you bring together people from different disciplines to discuss questions of utmost importance for the future, for the safety of global citizens on this planet. So we hope that the conversation continues not only tonight, also tomorrow. You are all invited to join both workshops and the evening panel, and I look forward now to listening in, as I have not been able to join the whole day, so for me this will be a great opportunity also to see more of the brains coming to fruition here in their conversation around this very important Alpine Swiss table. Thank you very much. Anything else? Yes, and now let me actually introduce you also to another important representative of Switzerland, our legal advisor at the embassy in Switzerland, Roland Portmann. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to take a minute to convey to you the greetings of the ambassador of Switzerland in the United States, Mr. Martin Dahinden. He's unfortunately not able to join you tonight here, but I think he is delighted, as we at the embassy are, that we have tonight's panel here in San Francisco, and this panel for us fits particularly well into the Swiss Touch campaign, because it combines traditional values that the General Council outlined of Switzerland with new challenges that we have now in the area of cyberspace. So we think it's particularly fitting to discuss that around the Swiss Touch table tonight and to bring these two aspects together. So I'm looking forward especially to the panel tonight, and I think now it's the time for them to start.
Not quite. Let me just say that this conference is actually a follow-up to an event series and workshop series we had here at Swissnex called Everyone a Humanitarian, that took place between last December and last March. Everyone a Humanitarian had about 7 public events and 12 workshops exploring new collaborative forms of humanitarian action. All of that took place on a huge carpet we had here in this space, highlighting the Geneva Conventions. And the idea for the Crisis Code conference came about during the last event that was focusing on the future of humanitarian data. And when we discussed new digital technologies humanitarians were using, we discovered not only the huge benefits they can have, but also the potential risks they entail for crisis-affected populations. These days, for example, you can find satellite imagery of refugee camps that are published open access online. That's great for humanitarians because they can take action very quickly. At the same time, it's information that can potentially be used for the enemy.
And nobody, or nearly nobody, is as conscious of these new territories of threat than our moderator, Mr. Joseph Gay. It's very relevant where, in fact, this series came from. It came from the last workshop of the Everyone Humanitarian series, and that workshop was led by Joseph Gay. Joseph, who is a fellow at an associate at the Policy Lab. He is a digital humanitarian in every fiber of his being, and he is the co-architect of all or much of the content of these 2 days. Joe, thank you very much for being our moderator tonight. Take it away.
Okay, is this thing on? You can probably tell I'm really excited because of the incredible expertise and the brain power at this table right now. So it's probably the most interesting table I've ever sat on. So it's pretty cool. So thank you guys for showing up. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. And if you can just sort of wait until the end and then we show them our appreciation for joining us today. To my left, we have Jeff Moss. He is a commissioner for the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, founder and CEO of DEF CON, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a member of the Homeland Security Advisory for DHS. Further on my left, we have Paul Nicholas. He is the head of Global Security Strategy and Diplomacy team at Microsoft. To his left, we have Eva Galperin. She is the Director of Cybersecurity at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. To her left, we have Sanjana Hadatua. He is a special advisor to the ICT for Peace Foundation. And to his left, we have my colleague and dear friend, Nathaniel Raymond, Director of the Signal Program for Human Security and Technology. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So Jeff, I'd like to start with you if I could, and in the spirit of sort of exploring emerging threats in cyberspace in terms of the evolving capabilities of nefarious actors, what keeps you up at night?
Okay, first turn on the microphone, there we go. I'd say the things we're facing, there's nothing really new under the sun, it's just we've caught up. Things we predicted 10 years ago are happening now. The attacks are getting easier. Attacks always get better, they never get worse. Attacks always get cheaper, they never really get more expensive. So I worry that there's sort of a critical mass of things happening now. We've got internet, IoT devices that are cheap, getting powerful and connected, and that ties into a previous threat of denial of service, which ties into another problem about fragility of the network, which ties into another problem of third-party dependence. And so what we're seeing now is all of these things are coming together, and we're sort of getting this perfect storm where if you're a nation state, there's a lot of stuff you can steal now. There's this trend of concentration. 20 years ago, there wasn't a Facebook. All the eggs were not in one basket. And if you wanted to steal a lot of data, you would have had to break into 50,000 machines. Well, now if you're a government, I can tell you who you're going after. You're going after Facebook and Google and Microsoft, and the concentration of data turns these things into very attractive targets. And not just in the United States, in other countries, just think about it. And so I think about sort of two things, which to me will be a big event. One is when a denial of service attack is so big and so prolonged that it puts a company out of business. We almost saw this with Sony, but it didn't happen. They're still in business, Sony movies, not Sony the company. But imagine if that attack was successful and 600 people lost their jobs. And then imagine that it happens to the newspaper that criticizes North Korea, and they go out of business, and there's 1,000 jobs idled. And then another company, 2,000 people. How long before the government decides that they're going to, quote unquote, solve the problem and get involved? Right? We can't have citizens. We seem to be okay if people are having all their identities stolen and money stolen. But I don't think we're going to be okay if we're being put out of work. I think the government in that case will clearly take a stand. So that's one thing that when that happens, we'll all know it because it's going to be a big deal. And the other thing is the first time an internet-connected toaster burns down a house and kills someone, we're going to start to get product liability. And that will be a huge sea change because right now software is the only thing in the world that has a software shrink wrap license waiver of liability. Doesn't exist in any other industry. So something, and it's going to be the Internet of Things, is going to finally make the software industry be the same as every other industry on the planet.
Thanks, Jeff. In turning to Paul and trying to really understand the scope or the severity of the situation, how bad is the situation? And it would be good if we could sort of start to hone in on sort of who's doing what. Presumably, it's not just all of the same types of people online doing things. We've got state actors, we've got non-state actors. How is this all coming together in terms of global security?
Sure, thanks very much. I think Jeff did a great job sort of outlining the sum of all fears. Oops, can you hear me now? Oh, sorry, okay. I thought you did a really nice job describing the sum of all fears. Yeah. I'd like to share with you a quote I came across recently that I thought was an interesting way to sort of frame this discussion. A number of years ago, Helen Keller actually made a really interesting observation that went as follows. Security is mostly superstition. Doesn't exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. And I think that has a lot to do with the world we live in cybersecurity. It's a real challenge. We're never actually going to be secure. It's going to be something that we pursue. And as Jeff described, the tools, techniques, and practices that put that at risk are growing. They're getting faster, they're getting cheaper, they're getting more controllable. I think one of the things that really concerns Microsoft as we look forward into the future to a world that truly is cloud dependent is what we sort of see as an overinvestment in offense. If you look at numbers that the National Security Agency puts out, there's around 30 countries in the world today that have declared offensive capabilities. And some people argue, well, you only have to worry about 4 of those countries, or 7, or maybe 10. But the reality is, if you're a global ICT provider, you have to worry about the countries that get lucky. We are in a fragile space, and we need to figure out new ways of thinking about this. We were joking and talking a little bit before this about, people are really quick to throw out this term, cyberwar. People really don't go to war that often. Governments engage each other in conflict, and they stay well below the law of armed conflict. And that's where a lot of the danger, damage, and disruption happens in cyberspace today. On the other hand, you have about 80 countries in the world today that are trying to pass cybersecurity laws. Wow, so think about that. You have 30 plus countries trying to build offensive capabilities to attack, and you have 80 plus countries trying to build legislative frameworks to try to protect critical infrastructure and manage things. And one of the things that it really puts at risk is innovation and how you're able to respond and think about these. And some pretty strange things come out of those types of tensions between attack and regulation. I think as we move into the future, we really have to think about fundamentally new ways of approaching international security. Can we have a meaningful capability for exchanging vulnerabilities? Will governments actually start to adopt vulnerability equity capabilities? Will governments exercise restraint when it comes to developing cyber capabilities? Meaning, will they develop things that are targeted and narrow and not globally destructive? How do you balance the types of things that governments want to invest in for national security and also manage the defense of the things that make our lives possible today? That's a discussion that in some ways has happened a little bit at the United Nations over the past 10 years as they've struggled to try to find a way forward. But that's been a discussion between governments. We need a discussion that I think really brings governments, the private sector, and also the humanitarian community together. We need to think differently about the things that face us today. As Jeff mentioned, some of the issues that we faced in tech have been denial of service, denial of actually our data, and in some cases, actually destruction of data. And as I've heard and from different people in the workshop today, as some people actually take those cyber consequences to their means, it actually puts people's lives at risk. And how do we think about that for our most vulnerable populations? I think we need a fundamental reset in how we're thinking about these issues as companies, as governments, and as the humanitarian community. How do we work together in new ways? So I'll stop there and move on.
Speaking of the future of warfare, Eva, I think your research lately has really provided us with some clarity as to how conflict is carried out in cyberspace. And so I'd like to ask you about how is information being weaponized in conflict zones that are more traditionally associated with sort of humanitarian situations like Syria, for example?
Can you hear me? There we go. All right. Only the best and the brightest get hired by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So I think that there are a couple of different layers to this question, and the first thing that I really want to push back against is this notion of cyber warfare. What most people think of as cyber warfare is really cyber espionage. It is misinformation campaigns, it can be harassment, but if you start thinking about this as cyber warfare, then the solutions that you think of become cyber missiles and cyber bullets, and then you end up at cyber Pearl Harbor, and we just have to turn around and leave because we are not anywhere productive. So, to be clear, the previous speakers have talked a lot about their concerns about cyber attacks between nation states, when nation states go at each other, or attacks by nation state actors on private companies or on private industry. This is not where the majority of my work is done. The majority of my work focuses on vulnerable populations. So journalists, people working for NGOs, people engaged in humanitarian work, the people who do not have an expectation that they have an entire department of a nation state working on their defense, the people who are left to defend themselves and who are being attacked in a highly asymmetrical way by very powerful actors. The next thing that we have to keep in mind is that not all nation-state actors are created equal. Frequently when we talk about nation-state actors, we're talking about the Five Eyes, we're talking about Israel, North Korea, China, and not a lot of other state actors. And these are all actors with extremely high levels of very sophisticated capability. And so for InfoSec people, this is the most interesting stuff, which is why we can't shut up about it. But I think that one of the things we really need to worry about in the future is that poorer nations that don't necessarily have the money to build out their own capability have really begun to enter the fray. And they've done so in a couple of different ways. The first is through the purchase of software through third-party vendors, frequently vendors that are based in Europe or most recently Israel. So if any of you have heard of NSO Group, I'm guessing in this room, Gamma, which made FinFisher, Hacking Team, which was most famously exposed a couple of years ago, and their entire mail spool was dumped and kept me busy for several weeks. So these are the kinds of things that the lower level actors are employing. And then we have an even newer layer of sort of cut rate spying, which is done when nation states buy these tools, discover that they're too hard to use, which we can see from the mail spools dumped from these companies, and instead turn around and just decide to hire full-time criminals to go do their spying for them. So I think that's really the biggest, the biggest and newest development that we've seen in the last couple of years. And what do these criminals do, you ask, as well as what do these companies do, and what do these, sort of smaller nation states do? A couple of different things. They engage in persistent phishing campaigns against their enemies. So they're sending out a lot of email with, fake Facebook logins and fake Google logins with different levels of sophistication. They are sending out desktop malware, stuff that works on Windows and on OS X and on Linux. So if anybody tells you that you should switch to Linux because it's totally safe and there's no malware on it, just stop. And increasingly, we're starting to see these companies these countries very interested in mobile capability. And so we're seeing them attack iPhones and more commonly going after Androids, because it's very easy to sort of sneak a backdoored app into the Android market. So those are really the most common vectors of attack that we've seen. If you would like more information about the kind of attacks faced by civil society in the United States, EFF has just published a report called Fish for the Future, which documents a campaign of phishing against two of our fellow traveler organizations, Free Press and Fight for the Future, which is why I had so much fun naming this campaign. This was a non-nation state group that persistently, for about 2 months, went after these two NGOs, specifically for the purpose of breaking into their Google accounts with like a side interest in sort of their YouTube and phishing accounts, with a series of sort of increasingly clever phishes, but not so clever that they could not be foiled by two-factor. So if there's anybody here who does not have two-factor authentication turned on any of their accounts, please do so now. You can do it while we're giving this talk. It's that easy. If you have questions, you can come see me after class and I will walk you through it. So I think that's probably the best summary of what I think is going on right now.
Thanks, Eva. Just a quick follow-up to the notion of how sort of conflict is conducted. Is there anything qualitatively different about the stuff that you guys surfaced, for example, with the, I may get this name wrong, the Syrian Digital Army or something like this? Or is it, as we say, just sort of amplified business as usual?
Oh, it's absolutely business as usual. I mean, we saw the conflict in Syria change a lot over time, and I sort of dropped out of it right around the time when it started being nation-state actors versus nation-state actors. But the Syrian Electronic Army was not originally part of the two pro-Assad groups that I was tracking for about 2.5 years that were going after anti-Assad groups online. And one of the ways that they were doing that was that they were seeding posts onto anti-Assad Facebook groups with links to malware that people would then download onto their computers. And they didn't really have mobile capability at the time. So in some ways, it's kind of old hat. There has also been a really interesting report put out by Citizen Lab, I think about a year and a half ago, talking about how the Syrian Electronic Army and sort of associated actors have moved on in sophistication to a sort of femme fatale attack, where they will go after specific people in the opposition, pretending to be women who are interested in them, send them sexy time pictures, and the sexy time pictures have the malware in them.
Thanks. Sanjana, you work a lot with local actors on the ground, activist groups, grassroots organizations, community-based organizations. How are local actors encountering these issues in terms of their vulnerabilities in the work that they may do, or their capability to mitigate these threats and respond to them?
I'm going to push back on that question because I think that we parade this term as grassroots as one homogeneous entity. And I don't know what the bloody hell that means, really. Anybody who's worked at the grassroots for any substantial amount of time would recognize that the grassroots, this term, is as fractured and splintered as any other segment of polity and society. And that's the first recognition we need to make. It's not one homogeneous entity. So it's contextual, as with many other things. And if I were to draw a broad brushstroke to the question that is asked of me, I suppose there's this dichotomy, this weird existence of two things. One is a glut of innovation, and the other is a paucity of information. And the two are inextricably entwined. The recognition that those of us here behind this alpine table in San Francisco are the arbiters of all the answers the grassroots needs, I think is absurd. And it's quite violent, if I may say so, because it is the inability of the likes of us to recognize that there is, in the absence of any other means of help, innovation at the grassroots level by those people who are themselves victims of what they face. And the response also comes through that context of austerity that sometimes leads us to go in and parachute in with our answers and be met with the kind of responses that we get. And then we are surprised as to why they are not more hospitable to our, in a sense, elitist burden or white person's burden or an upper social strata burden. So I think the first is that there is a lot of innovation on the ground with communities and people at risk around what they feel they need to do. That is then twinned with the paucity of information around what actually can be done and what resources are available. So they make do with what they have, but when we observe what they are doing, we see a lot of things that can be done better and can be made stronger and should be done in a different way. And I think that's an interesting via media that we have to bridge, because these communities aren't bereft of innovation, but they also can be helped with a lot of what they can do in order to respond to what they face. At risk of possibly being undiplomatic in the most diplomatic of settings, it also is concerning, and I just want to put this on the table, that the person of color on the table is asked to speak about the grassroots. Why should that be the case? Why can't any of you speak about the grassroots? Why does it have to be me? And I think that is also a consideration in the hierarchy of the power that addresses these problems, where you often have solutions that are not endogenous to the context. They're not organic. They may be, with the best of intentions, ending up with the worst of outcomes. So in Myanmar, where a colleague of mine in the audience and I have worked extensively, in Sri Lanka, in Kabul, where I've been to, in MENA countries, in the south of Thailand, in Indonesia, in many, many of these countries, I'll end by saying that the repositories and the reservoirs of the responses that are needed to address the problems that are topical, timely, and relevant reside within local contexts and are not brought in by outsiders. And particularly unhelpful is the overarching, overbearing, sometimes stentorian outlook of technology companies, which don't understand the local context, but from San Francisco think they have the answers. Secondarily, I think there is a humility required to go in and actually help the communities, and that is necessary and can be done. But you need to be sensitive to the local dynamics, and particularly the gendered dynamics, which we never really talk about, and also the local cultural traditions, etc., that are needed to really engage with what can be sustainable, what is enduring, and what can be built upon by those communities moving forward. And I think that nuanced discussion, that problematization is often lacking at the meta level here in this table and similar tables around it. I'm not saying that we are all culpable of it, but I think that that nuanced argument around what actually communities on the ground face, what they do, and what help they can receive is often lacking in conversations like this.
Well, I'm glad after all I did ask you that question, it turns out. Thanks, Sanjana. Nathaniel, in addition to sort of thinking about threats as external to what we're doing, a lot of the work that you guys do at HHI is to really think about the risks and vulnerabilities that we as humanitarian actors may introduce in terms of the information activities and digital services that we carry out as a sector, for example. So can you just explain that dynamic a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to answer your question after I make just one quick framing point. I thought we would have a lot of agreement around this very handsome Swiss table. And we do, but we actually have some disagreement, and I want to put it out there back to the question of business as usual. I believe we are at a pivot point in human history equal only to the aftermath of World War II. We are at this moment, and I will be very blunt, at the start of a third world war on trust. It is a war on trust. It is a war on institutions, a war on the creation of narratives of knowledge and of clarity. Technology is involved in it, but it's not fundamentally about technology. It is about an attack on the ability to have normative frameworks. It's an attack on the global structure built in the aftermath of World War II for the past 80 years. And I think I miss my grandfather very much, but in a way I'm glad he's not here because he would be going nuts at our timidity in the face of a historical moment that requires more than convenings, it requires courage. And what's occurring now is the weaponization of data against the most vulnerable people, but also against the protective institutions and laws, including the Geneva Convention and other forms of international humanitarian law that protect them and protects humanitarians. So to answer your question, Joe, about what we face as humanitarians, we face a moment where, and there's obviously going to be someone in the audience who says, how much do norms really matter anymore? How much does the Geneva Convention or humanitarian status matters more? Well, the only thing worse, to quote Churchill, is the alternative. And right now we're looking at targeting, anecdotal and the beginning of quantitative evidence by our colleague, Dr. Kate Starbird at University of Washington, Seattle, who we're working with at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative to look at targeted misinformation attacks to rupture and shatter bonds of trust between humanitarian actors in Syria and the communities they seek to serve. And we had a colleague today from the Atlantic Council, I believe, talking about similar operations in the Ukraine. We're looking at an effort by state through non-state proxy actors to use social media and to use misinformation combined with cyberkinetics. Did I get cut off? Yeah. To basically destroy the protective space that the Geneva Conventions provide. And what that means, to Sanjana's point, is that it's about rupturing bonds between communities, responders from communities, responders coming into communities, and in that moment, we're talking about the future of the humanitarian principles themselves. humanity, neutrality, independence, impartiality, being fundamentally in hazard. And so what I worry about most is I worry about us. The people in this room and the people not in this room. We're having debates, we're having conversations, we're having meme, do you say meme? Is that right? Yeah, meme fights. But we're not having a conversation, as Frederick Douglass said, the power concedes nothing without a demand. We have not made a demand to retrofit to our historical moment the normative frameworks required. Now that may be, as our colleagues from Microsoft are calling for, a 5th Geneva Convention. I don't know. But we need to be having that conversation in a political fashion, not just a bunch of people at a beautiful Swiss table.
Paul, is there something, some way that we sort of can, well, I mean, it's talking about the Digital Geneva Convention, or to talk a bit about, are these ideas sort of surfacing in the conversations that you're happening about the truly transformative shift that's happening in international security?
Yeah, no, we absolutely have to think about how. Okay, here we go. we absolutely have to have a frank and sustained conversation about how we evolve international law to deal with the challenges that we face today. I was talking to an official in Germany recently who made the interesting comment. It said, you know, I can call any German CEO in the middle of the night and they'll talk to me for hours about digital transformation. But if I ask them about information security, they'll hang up and ask me to call their chief information security officer. What that really means is industries, companies, organizations, humans are going through this really fundamental change where we're integrating technology across basically our entire life. It's opening up new risks, and those risks are also targeted by people, and we get this sort of erosion of protections that fall well below the law of armed conflict, and they allow people to be targeted in ways that we're just not used to, and we don't have a way to protect them. We started a conversation around this idea of a digital Geneva Convention in February. It was kind of shocking to some policy people because they were like, oh, this is a really horrible idea. But the idea was, how do we try to control conflict, not content? And what is that debate, and what forum should it exist in? There are no answers. I think this is an opportunity where we can all start to put things on the table to talk about what are meaningful steps for moving forward.
There's this interesting debate going on in some of the security community, which is the nature of the technology essentially creating the laws by which we live by? And so it's sort of a tail wagging the dog. The engineers that built the nature of the internet made decisions that have impacts on all of our lives. You know, lack of privacy in certain protocols, lack of security in certain protocols. But the engineers did that for what they thought was a good reason at the time, and now 30 years later, we're living with it. And so we're still in this period where the technical teams are developing the tools that we all have to live by, but they don't have diversity of input. They don't have humanitarians on the team. They don't have policymakers. And a lot of times my role in DC is trying to explain to policymakers what they're going to have to live with because of decisions by technologists. And at some point, we're going to have enough informed policymakers that they can kind of almost flip the conversation, right? We want technology that sort of does X, as opposed to getting whatever the technology is they receive. So I think that tipping point is coming, and I've activated Eva over here.
I will now form a Voltron. Actually, I am going to talk about Ethiopia. So there's been a lot of talk at this table about international norms and about the rule of law. And so I wanted to talk about a time when EFF tried to actually impose the rule of law on a nation state that decided to use surveillance malware to spy on an American citizen located in Silver Springs, Maryland. So our client, who chose to remain anonymous, but by the pseudonym of Kidane, was a gentleman who had grown up in Ethiopia and was part of the large Ethiopian diaspora that is located outside of Washington, D.C. He had remained politically active and therefore was of interest to the Ethiopian government. And the Ethiopian government decided to express their interest in the form of installing surveillance malware on his laptop. Our forensic analysts were able to demonstrate that they successfully spied on some of his Skype conversations and also spied on some of his Google searches. Now, I don't know how many lawyers there are in this room. Lawyers, hands up, hands up, hands up. A couple lawyers. So that's a violation of the wiretapping statute, which is the case that EFF made in court, and it took several years to wind through court and through appeal, and the judge who finally got our appeal did not agree and decided that as long as the Ethiopian government was not actually present in the United States with an agent, as long as they were doing all of their spying via software, that it was A-okay. Now, this is a terrible precedent that I think that everyone should be deeply, deeply outraged about. And I am very interested in creating a new test case in order to argue that this was an absolutely awful ruling for privacy in the United States. But this is also something that we should keep in mind when we talk about norms and we talk about laws, which is that in the end, the norms and the laws don't matter as much as we might think that they do. That the way the state of play works now is you just go forth, and if you get caught, maybe you've got to face the music.
All right, now it's on. Here we go. Yeah, it's gonna kick, yeah. So as someone who has spent a significant portion of my career in humanitarian response in Ethiopia and has been persona non grata in certain East African countries, which I won't name on the advice of counsel, it is precisely those environments that require norms. And knowing some of these dictators very well and what they do as having been a war crimes investigator in a past life, they care very much about being in bounds or being perceived to be in bounds in the context of norms. And I say it again, not to be redundant with what I said before, try a world without norms, or even the patina of norms in terms of the context of the threat vectors we're seeing now. Now we're heading that way. We're heading that way. If you look at several years ago when the responsibility to protect was agreed by the United Nations, which is now, we can safely say, dead, stuffed, and mounted as a viable political context and concept. But the responsibility to protect basically has died. And we're looking at a world that reflects the death of that norm. I think for me, and we can disagree with this interpretation, that's a call for not only norms, but for evaluation of norms. And so it's not norms alone, but it's the process of giving those norms capacity.
I think you may be misinterpreting my argument.
Okay.
I'm not arguing against norms. I'm pointing out that this is a case in which norms have failed. I am a person who works for a digital civil liberties organization that does impact litigation. If I didn't believe that the law made a difference, I would be doing something else with my life.
Fair point. But I think there's a sort of nihilism that's been creeping in where people have lost faith in the power of normative frameworks and the power of law. And let's be very blunt about the context of the election in the United States. And I think the worst thing we can do right now is to walk away from norms when we have a political context with a commander-in-chief that has in many ways declared war on certain norms which define us as Americans. Now is a time where I think norms matter more and are demonstration of commitment to norms is essential. So maybe we're in violent agreement.
I hope that we're in violent agreement because I am literally looking for another test case for this. But I think it's also very important to acknowledge that norms are not going to save us.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
I'd
Okay.
like,
Fist fight over.
yeah. I'd like to pick up on something that Nathan said at the end of his first comment, and that's the capacity to actually develop and enforce norms. I think all around the world there is a real need right now for capacity building in cybersecurity. You see it at the nation state level, you see it in humanitarian organizations, you see it all over the world. This is something that we oftentimes give lip service to, but we actually need a sustainable, meaningful way to invest in capacity building to actually move ourselves forward.
When I was the Chief Security Officer at ICANN, a big chunk of my budget was in CBMs, confidence building measures, and trying to essentially help countries learn to fish. Right? They have to have the confidence to operate their infrastructure. They have to be able to respond to attacks. And if they're not confident, it gets outsourced. And then, you know, it's all bad. Point out on the confidence, I'm sorry, not confidence building measures, on the norms, since we said it so many times, like a genie is supposed to appear. We keep saying norms. One of the things that's going on in the norms world is, in my work in the Global Commission, is there needs to be norms around civilian infrastructure, what's on and out of bounds limits. And so essentially, in the olden days, 70s, 60s, the West had dual-use economy, and the Soviets had single-use economy. Now everybody is dual-use. So therefore, is everybody's infrastructure inbound for covert operations or not? And if you're going to say, well, certain bits of civilian infra, critical infra, are out of bounds, what's that going to be? Is that hospitals? Do I put a big red X on my server farm? And now that's like an ambulance and don't drop the cyber bomb on me. And so we need to find a norm to really try to explore what would that critical infrastructure be that's so critical that, is it power generation, you know? And I think, once you start that conversation, you have to be really careful where it goes. But we have to have that conversation. A lot of what we've been talking about is we've gotten here because we've never had the conversation, and we're here just because this is the way the internet got built. And it's now so critical, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations.
So in this case, it kind of seems like we're getting toward, well, what do we do about this situation? And I just want to ask the panel before we open it up to the audience for questions, starting with Nathaniel down at the end and just coming back here. What's the first step we ought to take?
Well, for our team last summer, we had a critical moment where we decided to stop innovating for a year and not innovate. And it was wonderful. You should take it. We call it the No Innovation Challenge. And it's like the Ice Bucket Challenge, but with less funding. So basically, what we decided to basically, for 6 months, and my colleague Dan Scarnecchio was critical in this effort, he's in the audience tonight, we wanted to identify what rights human beings have to information. What rights do human beings have to information in crisis? Because there was no clarity about it. And so we were constantly doing innovative things, and we had no rules of the road for us to abide by in terms of how that related to human rights. So we identified 5 rights, and I'll run them through and then just say one quick thing about the first right, is that people have a right to information. People have a right to protection from harm and how that information is accessed, transmitted, provided. People have a right to privacy and security. People have a right to data agency over their data and how it's collected. And people have a right to rectification and redress. So what we should be doing is about starting with right 1. So right 1 is a radical concept that we actually, is there a right to water? Do you have a right to water? Yes, but there isn't a right to water in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's actually a subsidiary or interconnected right of the right to housing, of all things, and a minimum standard of housing. Information is often thought of as in terms of freedom of speech, Article 19. But we now, because of what technology has done with the ICT revolution, it's actually Article 3, life, liberty, and security of person. And that's where we get the right to humanitarian assistance. And so the radical pivot that we're offering at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative at the Signal Program is saying information itself now is aid necessary for survival that predicates traditional forms of aid that were protected: food, water, medicine, shelter, the big four. So what we have to do is get agreement that we are in a moment where the role of information, because of technology, has changed as it relates to human survival. And thus, our norms and our capacity around those norms needs to change with it.
So what is the question?
First step, most important thing to get right.
I think the answer comes from the feminist movement, which is that the personal is the political. It is the understanding that what happens at one tier of society, and arguably for the purposes of discussion at the grassroots level, invariably influences and impacts every other tier above it or around it. It's going in with that understanding that what happens to a woman or a child or a tribe or a community or an ethnic group that is at the margins and periphery of a particular context necessarily impacts the way we think about norms and the technologies as a consequence that are either contributing to their marginalization or will contribute to their emancipation. And I think that to think of Silicon Valley as the global arbiter of that conversation is fraught with challenges. Having said that, I don't have a concrete answer as to what the alternative is, and perhaps it is beginning to listen to local voices, which sounds almost passé. And we always say it, but we never
can't
do
ask
it.
somebody on a panel that's for sure.
Well, it is to begin to, as I said, at the risk of repeating myself, to begin to maybe think of what was said by the earlier speaker, and I always come to it in something that is a very simple word. It's dignity. The indignity that people suffer as a consequence of denial and illiberal democracy and the erosion and the evisceration of democracy is real and tangible. This is not some highfalutin concept. And for me, I can only speak of my life and my life struggle. It is to give expression to, voice to, people who already are not victims all the time, but have stories to say, lives that matter, and are needed to be recorded in history. And mind you, may I just stop by saying that very often there's an othering that takes place in these kinds of panels to think that this kind of narrative and discourse is only in what my color represents, which is the global south. And for us in Sri Lanka, it is a matter of deep concern and quite frankly sadness that the Black Lives Matter movement here, the social fabric in a country we look up to, the United States of America, is at risk and is falling apart. So I would imagine that what we are talking about here needs to perhaps not start with Bangladesh or Pakistan, but just on the outskirts of San Francisco, when the digital divide is quite stark. Or Charlottesville, absolutely.
So my fellow panelists at this very expensive Alpine table have already made a lot of really great macro points. And so I thought that maybe it might be useful for me to get into something more concrete. And I think that you made possibly the best point, which is that this is not necessarily about Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or, say, Mexico City, but also Charlottesville and Oakland and Fruitvale BART Station. So, and as my report from earlier today shows, also this is a matter which affects activists in the United States who are doing this sort of grassroots work. And so we can't pretend that these things are all separate. what I think the most important thing that people can do right now is there are a few things that you can do to make yourself a harder target, whether it is for a first-tier nation state or a third-tier nation state or a bunch of anonymous hackers or some bored criminals. If you turn on two-factor authentication and get a password manager and spend a little time taking a look at your public profile in the world and maybe locking some stuff down, you can make it much, much harder to compromise your account and therefore compromise your entire organization and put other people in danger. And I think that that is incredibly important, and that is something that every single person here can do today.
Well said. I think we need a dialogue that puts us on a path to a meaningful international cybersecurity framework. That's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in 3 years. It may take 10 years till we get there. But it's an investment that I think we have to make if we're going to realize the benefits that technology promises. And that's a global technology base. It's not what comes out of Silicon Valley, but it's what comes out and emerges all over the world. And it needs to be held on a platform where we can all participate as citizens, as governments, as companies, as humanitarians. The risks that we face by not having this dialogue, we can either have it now proactively, where we have a chance to evolve things, or we can have it after really bad things happen, and we can have a reactionary one that may put us in a world we really don't like.
And Jeff, before you go, can you just please say DEF CON Humanitarian Exchange Program? Was that your idea?
DEF CON Humanitarian Exchange Program. Yeah, I'll say it. While touching it's channeling the power of the Alpine. And now I'm completely forgot what I was going to respond to something he said. Man, I forget.
Active dialogue?
Don't know. Okay, but I do have my point written down here, which was, I want to circle back around to something I said earlier, which was around software liability. And I hate government intrusion, but I feel like all other things have failed us. Market forces were going to save us, where consumers would buy products that are inherently safer, like we would buy the Volvo with a better airbag, and pretty soon people are competing on security because, but consumers don't have enough information to buy a secure software product. So, and they compete on features, and if you do security research, you realize the more features you have, the more attack surface you have, so we're actually competing on the thing that makes us more insecure. So the market forces failed us. But that's okay, insurance is going to save us. Companies will have their insurance rates adjusted based on if they're using secure or insecure software. And then it turns out there's not enough information, and okay, now we're down to regulation. And this is where I think liability is going to come into play, because I haven't done the study, but boy, if I could get some money and some free researchers, I would love to figure out the majority of the losses of intellectual property, consumer data around the world. I bet the majority of it comes from only a few sources. I bet it's Adobe with their Flash and their Acrobat products being historically terrible. I mean, if you look at these products, 15 years of constant compromise. If you look at, when you're getting spearphished, what are they doing? PDFs, Acrobat, Microsoft Office. There's only a couple of things that they consistently use. So why does Adobe as a company for 20 years get to enable the theft of all of our intellectual property with no consequence, no liability for 20 years? I bet they've enabled billions and billions of dollars of theft, and they have no consequence. I don't see how that can stand. Microsoft enables, macros again on Office. What do you know? The last year has been nothing but waves of sophisticated macro attacks on Office, because now it's turned on by default. It's an insecure default configuration now, where before it was secure. No consequence. And I think at some point, there has to be consequences for people deploying default insecure software. That's all. And when that happens, that will influence the way the technologists build technology, and that will change how we all interact with the internet.
Thank you.
Well, as the lawyer, I expect a rebuttal.
I'm not a lawyer.
Maybe we'll offer the opportunity for the audience to ask some questions and get them involved. Benjamin, what are we looking at for time? 18 minutes. Yeah, okay, 20 minutes. So let's open it up, if I may, to, well, I'm just going to see, okay, and Kirsten, if you will. Someone will bring you a microphone. That's me.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for the comments of the panelists, which I found very interesting. I'd like to circle back to critical infrastructure, which I think is a really crucial issue. And just to give you, these are really strange mics, just to give you a little bit of context, I've been the consultant to the group of governmental experts at the United Nations since 2009, the GGE that we've been talking about. I swear it's going to be in my mouth if I put it in closer. Okay, so the GGE, negotiating what is critical infrastructure at the international level, I think, is pretty much impossible. And let me give you the context for that. I can say that within the GGE, we've had conversations about what... I'm just going to shout. Thank you. I'm just going to shout now. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
This is my mommy voice, all right? So critical infrastructure is a really important issue, and yet every country defines it differently, and that's not going to be negotiated at the international level, right? One of the things I found really interesting talking to different governments that were around the table in the GGE process is that they were saying that, okay, we can all agree that there are some critical infrastructures that are just so terrible to attack. We might not all agree on banking industry, or we might not all agree on dams or energy grids, but we can all agree, like, attacking nuclear facilities, super bad, right? Everyone, good, bad, yeah. Everyone says bad, bad, bad. But we can't actually make that a norm. We can't say anything about that, because that will prioritize one type of critical infrastructure over everything else, which might give somebody the idea that as long as you don't attack that critical infrastructure, we might not react quite as, you know, it gives you kind of a threshold where below that we're all okay, or we won't, like, bring out the big guns, quote unquote, literally or figuratively, right? You have other states at the table in the United Nations saying, well, we don't have any nuclear power plants, right? So we don't want to put that in the report and not put in our electricity grid, or not put in our telecommunications network, or things that are important to us. So if we're not going to be able to agree at the international level, what is critical infrastructure? What is the alternative? Where do we go with the protection of critical infrastructure? Is it only at a national level that we can start to define that, about what we need to do to secure, and particularly in humanitarian responses, our critical infrastructure? I think you're going to have to.
Well, if there's anyone listening from, is this
It's quite easy.
yeah. Have I now? Can I try that one? Okay, great. If there's anyone listening from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I know you're out there, the first step is we need a commentary process with a capital C. Before we talk about Brad Smith's call from Microsoft for a 5th Geneva Convention, we need an official commentary on how the current Geneva Conventions apply to these questions. We have pieces of it, we have the Talon Manual, but we do not have an official assessment of how to interpret IHL now, related to the question of critical infrastructure and the other related ones. But I want to put something out there, because I think the whole we're going to catalog everything ain't going to work. When I was but a young humanitarian aid worker with Oxfam, preparing for shock and awe in Iraq, we were in meetings in Washington with the US government and Iraqi National Congress and others, and we were raising urgent concerns that if you hit the power grid to knock out the anti-aircraft capability, two things were going to happen. You were going to kill the blood bank in Baghdad's blood capacity, and the second thing you were going to do is turn off the pumps, keeping waste out of the streets, human waste. And within 48 hours of shock and awe, all the blood was gone and the streets were filled with sewage. And that was, you know, over 15 years ago. And so right now, and even then, talking with folks at Naval War College and Judge Advocate Generals, they didn't have the clarity that they needed to distinguish infrastructure. And now that's on steroids, times a million. So I want to put out something provocative here. It's not going to be about infrastructure per se. We're going to have to invert it. It's going to be about effects. It's going to be about prohibitive effects in scenarios on populations, rather than saying this gauge on this thing. It's going to be saying deleterious effect. It's about proportionality. It's about the concept translating proportionality to layered cyberkinetic and kinetic operations with an effect metric in the law. That's what I think is going to do it. It's not going to be simply, this is a digital hospital, this isn't, because A, that doesn't work, and B, it's not going to politically work.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, around the world, most countries have done surveys of their critical infrastructure. Some countries at 16, some at 17. Individual countries know what they mean by critical infrastructure, and they're really not that far off. But I think the part that Nathan highlighted here was, if you attack a chemical plant, the effects of it are phenomenally different. You know, they cost lives, and you can't put that back in a bottle. And if you attack nuclear power plants or you attack certain types of infrastructures, the effects of particular systems in there have a very different effect. I was really sort of taken back at the G20 when the discussions took place around, should there be a norm around integrity around some of the sort of key systems in the international financial system, like should those be hands off? And I'm hopeful that at some point the G20 will actually move forward and agree to that. You know, I think that's a recognition that, yeah, ATMs are important, but they're not as important as international clearing and settlement. There's a recognition of some things there just shouldn't be tampered with.
I am not a lawyer, I am an engineer. I stand very close to lawyers, so they rub off on me. But let me tell you that the majority of crime on the internet is financial crime. And it's conducted by criminals who know they're breaking the law. So I'm not really sure how useful norms are going to be in this area.
Well, so I
have a separate question. So we've talked a lot about how to mitigate the effects of the other actors in the stakeholder group. One of the things that I've come across in disaster response is that we maybe need to be optimizing for the strengths of the other actors rather than saying, screw you, we're not going to play with you anymore. So are there any ways that you see the possibilities of the other people at the table with you and how they contribute to the ecosystem in a positive way that is not accessible to you?
So I'm a little unclear on the question. I mean, the other stakeholders, meaning us sitting here. I think I was involved in a DHS advisory report post-Katrina. And we spent a lot of time looking at what worked and what didn't and how FEMA and federal government, DHS, could respond to these incidents. And you find that in those kinds of crises, the federal government plays like a very small role, and it's really all the other groups around them. It's enabling other people to find ways to contribute. So I think it's a very important point. You want to enable situations where the people that with the best fit in time and skills can plug in and help in their capacity. And it has a whole bunch of different social benefits, from giving people a way to contribute to specific skills. And you would find that, what was the one case? Cell phone companies that just lowered cell phone towers before the hurricane hit could bring them up again. And now all of a sudden there's a certain amount of network connectivity. People that had trucks of a certain size could bring in a certain amount of water, and as long as you could tell them where to deliver the truck, that made a huge difference. It was really simple things, but without any sort of coordination, it all fell apart.
Katrina changed my life. Everything I do now, every day, is because of what happened to me in Katrina. I was responder in Biloxi with Oxfam on the peninsula in the Division Street community, and primarily African-American community. 3 days after landfall, they had no aid. And it comes back to cell phone towers, where basically you had a digitally invisible community that had disproportionate, before the storm, access, because of credit checks, in many cases, to cell phones. And so what I learned then is that the white community was significantly more resilient because they had cell phones, they had cars, they had flood insurance, they could leave their property, they weren't worried about whether they could get compensation for that. But for those who only had that asset, their lack of information caused them to paralyze.
Yeah, they didn't know which exits to go to, what were the safe routes, who had food.
Yeah, I'll never forget an 80-year-old woman wearing her Sunday best covered in mud. This woman sitting there on pews in her church, covered in mud in her Sunday best, and she wore it because it's the only thing she could carry. And she's looking at the helicopters flying overhead and say, they're flying all the time, but they're not landing here. That changed everything. And so the response is that you can't hack that. That's an issue of equity. And it's also an issue of regulation and regulatory capacity. So I predict three things, to answer your question, Willow, are going to inevitably happen to take the good stuff and to make the good stuff focus. There's going to eventually be an FDA for data in the United States. There's going to be an FDA for data in the United States. There will be a regulatory agency to centralize that function, for good or for bad. And we already see within FEMA them struggling with that. With our work with Harvey and with Irma, we see them struggling with the lack of a quarterback for that function. The other thing, the international community, there will be a coordination cluster, knock on the Swiss table. Hopefully there will be a central coordination function. Because right now it's not about good stuff or bad stuff, it's about organizing it into order of operations to professional standard. That's the problem. For a lot of things we don't have theory for.
Is this on? Okay, good. My name is Rebecca. I'm from South Africa. Firstly, I want to say thank you, because I think that what you do matters, and it matters for the world, and it matters for us. I want to bring an example to light of the recent Kenyan elections, where basically every aspect of the election was outsourced. I mean, down to the ballot papers, which were shipped in from Tanzania. And they outsourced their IT section to Cambridge Analytica, which has been attributed to the Trump campaign, as well as the Leave campaign for Brexit. You know, you talk about the need to establish capacity building and for norms to be established, and specifically in the developing world. What can people do against this underlying tide of antagonism between governments and their own people? So the fact that the infrastructure isn't there on a large scale, I mean, the gap between a developing country like, say, South Africa or Kenya and what is happening in Silicon Valley, because I think that humanitarian crises at their core stem from people being disenfranchised and being disempowered. And if you don't have, you know, access to internet, or your media is being censored, then immediately all of that goes away. So what can people be doing in these situations? Thank you.
So I think probably Jeff Moss will have a pretty good follow-up on this. But the first thing that I wanted to point out is that voting problems are not necessarily just a problem of the third world. That's not just something that happens in developing countries, and I don't want to leave everyone in this room with the impression that the United States and Germany and Great Britain and all kinds of other places that we think of as flourishing first world democracies don't have very serious problems with voting integrity. One of the most interesting things that happened this summer was that DEF CON had an event in which they invited people to come hack voting machines. And I think rather than explaining that, maybe I should just go ahead and hand it off to Jeff Moss. Jeff, you want to explain this?
Yeah, I guess. So I think to part of your question, I think of it under this umbrella of transparency. If citizens don't have transparency into sort of the organs of state, of the nation, then all kinds of suspicions are born and rumors, and it's generally bad, right? And so in the United States, there's a saying, right, sunlight is the best disinfectant. If there's not some transparency around something, we can get in a pretty bad situation. This is the situation with voting machines in the United States, where the manufacturer of the voting machines literally would sue researchers who were trying to take apart machines or try to figure out how these voting machines worked. You signed very restrictive NDAs. If you got your hands on them, you were just wrapped up in legalese. And so the hackers, we all knew these machines had to have problems, but nobody could get to them. And the manufacturers controlled the conversation. Everything's fine, we're experts, these other people aren't experts, anything they say, don't believe it, because they don't even have the machines. So they're not credible. And so finally, luckily, under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, there was a change a year ago, which allowed for critical infrastructure, specifically voting technology, an exception that allowed us to go after these machines because it was in the public interest. So I went and bought a bunch of machines, and found another friend, bought a bunch of machines, and we just invited all the hackers over and said, let's party. And within a half an hour, the first machine fell, and within a couple hours, all the machines fell. And the result is Virginia decertified those machines in the next election. And it was ugly. I mean, these machines are really, I mean, I could go on and on, but basically they're terrible. And the manufacturers are now in a position of trying to tell you they're not terrible. Well, without that transparency, without some hacktivists or hackers or I bought $3,000 of machines on eBay, and now I've got Virginia decertifying the machines. It's like, I didn't have to spend a lot of money, I didn't have the skills, I just had to provide a platform. And so you don't necessarily have to have the answer. Your superpower might be identifying the problem, getting some of the tools, and inviting everybody else to play. And you can have unknown results, right? I mean, the people were so terrified of this, there's a large group of verified voting. Academics that have been studying electronic voting for a long time, they were terrified that DEF CON was going to do this, because what happens if we try to hack the machines and we fail? Now all the voting machine companies will claim they're impervious. It's like, you don't understand how technology works. Like, there is no way these things are secure. Right? But they were just so, even the people who've been working next to you trying to move the needle, they might turn out to be your worst enemy sometimes, right? And so it's like sometimes you just have to do something. And that turned out to be, you know, unexpected win. But back to the lady's point about critical infrastructure, well, that was the United States' latest new critical infrastructure. DHS designated that as critical infrastructure last year. So the amount of critical infrastructure you have might be forever increasing.
So I had a brief response to that as well, and possibly from not a technocratic perspective. The erosion of faith in the electoral processes is not endemic to or special to South Africa. And maybe we can take inspiration from the former incumbent of the United States and the mantra about the audacity of hope, where you create mechanisms through which, outside of the party political structure, which I think alienates rather than embraces citizens, you work with young people. And the way, again, I can only speak to what we do in our part of the world, is around something called information and media literacy. Now, there's no quick win around this. Part of the irony of the situation is that, and it's counterintuitive, is that you would imagine that the greatest problems arise from the countries with the lowest literacy. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the countries with the highest literacy that uncritically consume and respond and react to information over social media vectors in particular around a certain demographic that spread rumor, disinformation, misinformation, create a lot of the problems that we see associated with electoral processes and the democratic fabric. The only way around that, there are short-term technocratic solutions, there are algorithmic solutions, there are Silicon Valley solutions, but the long-term, and I believe, and I would put and suggest to you the longer-term, more sustainable way of addressing this, which is not going to go away, is to talk from the primary and kindergarten up until tertiary around critically questioning what you consume and incorporating that into syllabi in as many levels as you can to help citizens become citizens, because, and I'll end by saying this, in many countries today, and it is not an insignificant distinction, we have voters, we don't have citizens. And the political distinction is critical to our understanding around the solutions, both technological as well, that we need to embrace in order to create strong electoral processes and the democracy that we want.
Thank you. And we just have one more question. I'd like to bring it over to our colleague over here.
Hi. Oops. Whoa. Okay. I would love to follow up on what you mentioned about the war on trust, and also think about, we've talked a lot about capacity building and infrastructure, but if you think about the concept of information as a right and extend that to the perspective of the regulators, specifically with the announcement this morning or yesterday by DHS that the immigration screening will include social media handles and possibly even Google searches. What does that mean in this context, that information is a right?
Let's wait a second. There we go. And I hope I can hear from my colleagues, because I'm sick of hearing myself talk. But let's talk about biometrics for a second. I don't want to learn anything about biometrics. Do we all know what biometrics are? So iris scanning, fingerprints, et cetera. You do it at the airport when you come into the country, et cetera. In a perfect world, I would learn nothing about biometrics. About 2 weeks ago, I was at Oxfam, Great Britain, in England, and having a conversation there with colleagues, and I realized I have to learn a lot about biometrics. And this is going to make sense in a second. In the humanitarian context, what we do on how we develop both regulatory and ethical regimes around data about people's bodies, because we're using it to register folks for everything now, for food, for shelter, to cross a border, when babies are born, live birth registration, et cetera. Right now, the humanitarian community has almost blindly become an extension of intelligence and military state apparatus for registration, and it's contingent on playing that role to get access to populations. So the issue of the right to information and also the right to data agency is not just about social media. It is about the physical integrity of the body. It's about the physical integrity of identity, of the integrity of self. Social media, the DHS regulations, that's going to be a million court cases that I'm sure you guys are going to be all up in that in the EFF. So I'll leave it to you all. But why I mention biometrics is that it's these moments, these sort of Waterloos of specific data types from which we will get precedents that will decide the future of human freedom in the 21st and 22nd century. So no big whoop, guys. The stakes are pretty low. So we have to stop thinking about figuring out biometrics or data set A or data set B. We have to have the rights framework that we can then apply to specific data modalities. It is that fusion that we're missing.
I've got, I'll try to be brief. I've got a story and I've got an observation which I totally support what he said. The problem with transparency, again, is that as soon as one of these things gets entered in a database incorrectly, how do you contest that? No, I'm Jeff. I'm not Mike. Well, but the data scanner says your biometrics is Mike. Well, now am I Mike? Can I go to his bank account? I mean, so there's going to be all kinds of problems. In the United States, they say credit agencies about 25 to 30% of the data in credit agencies are inaccurate. You know, translation errors, OCR errors, fat fingers, something. There's just a lot of errors. But now if we're tying this all back to an identity, there's going to be all kinds of other problems. And this reminds me that you brought this up as a humanitarian context. Years ago at DEF CON, one of the people wanted to go, he was with Army Biometrics, and they arranged to have a tour at the Bellagio, which at the time was one of the only casinos in Las Vegas using biometrics to scan the players in their card tables. And so, do you want to come along? And I'm like, oh, hell yeah, going to the surveillance center at Bellagio and seeing how this works. And so they were demonstrating this facial recognition system. And it's tied into this database. All the casinos pay money, essentially, and they subscribe to this facial recognition database of known cheats and scammers and organized criminals and people that they just don't want in their casinos. And so what would happen is you'd be seeing people play, and the surveillance person would say, that person's suspicious. Call down, if that person's wearing glasses and a hat, they're suspicious, ask for ID or kick them out of the table. They can't play here anymore. And they were having really good success with it. 10 years go by. And it turns out that before the database was even deployed, organized crime was in the database. Organized crime was in the database and knew exactly which one of their operators was in the database, what information they knew about the organized criminals. They could tamper with the data. And so it was almost like they were letting the criminals get caught that either didn't pay them protection money to have them cleaned out of the database. And so when you create these databases, you are creating whole new I'll just tell you one other thing. There's this terrible situation. There's a federal agency that has 5 different nation states in their domain controller. And so everybody's terrified, like, oh my gosh, 5 nation states in a US government agency. And I'm like, how do they timeshare? Like, you know, does Iran get Monday and China get Tuesday? And yeah, it's really fascinating. So I just want to, you want to think like the biometrics question is real. You can't rescind your face. Errors are going to be made. There's no transparency. And there's going to be real world consequences. And for the DHS thing, same thing. If I know that that's going to be a check and I don't like you, man, your Google is going to be terrible, right? I want to get you stopped at the border if I don't like you.
Thank you. All right, well, very interesting conversation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Benjamin and Martin, who will... Yeah, round of applause for the panelists. Yeah.
Thank you very much to all speakers tonight for that fantastic panel. Thank you very much, Joe, for moderating it. And I think we can give them a big round of applause for having to deal with this AV system. So, one of my main takeaways is that there seems to be so much confusion and misunderstanding around these cyber issues these days. That it seems to be a good time to talk about fundamental principles, fundamental definitions, norms, to create a common understanding in order to then together collectively engage around these issues and potentially find solutions to protect the dignity and the life of these affected populations in cyberspace.
As a closing word, many of our colleagues seem to believe, and with what seems to be good reason, that the future of humanity lies in revitalizing and updating and protecting our norms and our narratives. And for that reason, I commend you all to return tomorrow night for our second and final panel, Digital Policy for a New Humanitarianism. Thank you all. Enjoy a little Egyptian food and a glass of wine, and thank you for being here.